Sanctions, populism, friendshoring, de-risking, the deepening division of the world into two opposed camps, trade wars, technology wars, and wars pure and simple. What is today called the crisis of multilateralism is in reality a crisis of US supranationalist cosmopolitanism or US imperialism. So I've entitled my talk, Crisis of Western Imperialism, Opportunity for the World Majority. Few can doubt that the world's inherited institutions of international economic governance, erected after the Second World War, are in profound crisis. Sanctions, populism, friendshoring, de-risking, the deepening division of the world into two opposed camps, trade wars, technology wars, and wars pure and simple, like the ones that are going on precisely in this neighborhood, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. These are among the proliferating causes. The crisis is said to be one of multilateralism, by which is meant the practice of international negotiation among a large number of the world's countries, if not all of them, to conclude common agreements for mutual benefit. Those who label the crisis in this way call for revitalization of this practice. However, multilateralism is actually thriving. The world majority, that is to say, the bulk of the world which is not included in the West, have tired of waiting for the imperialist West in its current dangerously petulant huff to demonstrate its much-touted multilateralism, and is getting down to the business of negotiating a still expanding set of alternative institutions, whether of trade or credit or investment or payments. And there is more to come in the upcoming BRICS summit in Kazan later this month. The United States-led West, by contrast, and I will use the term to refer to the imperialist core of the world economy, as it was when the capitalist imperialism peaked in 1914, plus a small number of hangers-on that it has acquired since, as most clearly seen in a map of the countries that is imposing sanctions on Russia today. So this US-led West, which has for so long arrogated to itself the title of the keeper of the flame of this multilateralism, appears hell-bent on destroying the institutions it touted as its major achievements. Until recently, whether by weaponizing the dollar system, undermining the institutional core of the World Trade Organization, which is its dispute settlement mechanism, or bending the IMF's rules, for instance, against lending to a country at war, not to mention turning key United Nations agencies into playgrounds of corporate and Western NGO power. It's high time we woke up to the real content of the crisis. The structures of international economic governance burst after the Second World War were not pure and simply the work of multilateralism, but rather the vector sum of opposed forces and opposed principles. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, we had the United States. It sought to replace Britain as the managing segment of the world economy since the early 20th century, when it sensed that British power was waning. Having botched its first attempt to do so after the First World War, and according to its own leading intellectuals, I'm thinking of Henry Luce, the publisher of Life and Time magazines, got a second chance with the Second World War, it came to the negotiations at Bretton Woods and elsewhere, seeking supranational rules, essentially world laws, itself masquerading as world state, that is, the United States saw itself as essentially the substitute for the world state. And these ambitions, which the United States had already nursed by then for several decades, are the true origin of the theory of US hegemony, not any real state of affairs waiting to be theorized. The United States, at Bretton Woods and elsewhere, and this historical conjuncture, sought to transform the rest of the world into the equivalent of domestic territory, making national states redundant, fusing the world economies into a seamless whole for the benefit of US corporations, including by diminishing its allies' empires. As Karl Polanyi put it in a remarkably insightful article in 1945, the United States wished to return to a pre-1914 system of universal capitalism, when in fact, as he put it in his great book, The Great Transformation, it had collapsed once and for all and could not be brought back to life. This is what had happened in the 30 years crisis of 1914 to 1945. And the world, as Polanyi saw it, had objectively inclined towards planned economies and sought multilaterally derived international rules and norms that would enable and foster them. This universal capitalism that it sought, the United States deployed the extraordinary dominance that it had acquired over the world's economy as the only ally which, while suffering no war damage, expanded its economy and loan portfolio as never before as supplier of war material and credit to its allies. You see here a chart of US growth since the 1870s to about 2000. And the two big peaks you see there are the two world wars. You can see that the two world wars were the thing that really expanded the US economy. It's no wonder that the US economy is so addicted to wars. So that was the United States on the one hand. The opposed force was the rest of the world, which consisted of the United States' war-torn allies, as vulnerable to economic collapse as to the charms of communism, in an age when Uncle Joe was more popular in Europe than Uncle Sam, both at home and, of course, also in the sprawling empires of Europe. There was the Soviet Union and East European communist countries with their planned economies. And then there were the demands of the rest of the world, whether these countries were independent, as in Latin America and much of West Asia, or soon to be independent in Asia and Africa. And these demands were for industrialization and development. None of these three categories of countries could withstand the sort of liberal economy the United States sought to create without suffering economic damage and subordination, and they had no intention of doing so if they could help it. The story of the establishment of the structures of international economic governance after the Second World War is intelligible only if we understand that they were the outcome of an ongoing clash between these two principles of US supranationalism, sometimes helped by its allies and sometimes hindered by them, and the multilateralism of the rest of the world. The best way to understand US supranationalism is to understand that it as economically cosmopolitan. The German mercantilist Friedrich List used this expression in the mid-19th century to describe the sort of world order as envisaged by the then dominant capitalist country, Britain, designed for the benefit of British capital. A world opened up through formal or colonial or informal semi-colonial control for its commodities and capital, and to supply it with cheap commodities and labor. To this, List opposed the international world. So the cosmopolitan world is on the left here. It has no borders. It is simply a world over which the privileged, which can be controlled from London or New York or what have you. List, however, proposed a different type of world. To List, the world was international, a world of nation states, because he understood, as well as many others, including the United States' own Alexander Hamilton, and mercantilists like Henry Carey, like Marx, like Keynes, and like today's development state thinkers, that a world in which some nations have already industrialized and therefore can command world markets, the only way for further industrialization, which is key to development in other nations, the only way for them to escape the fate of being subordinated to the dominant capitalist countries, of being their hewers of wood and drawers of water, is through the use of protection. And the entire slew of policies, infant industry protection, industrial policy, directed credit, export promotion, subsidies, tariffs, capital controls, among others. While such state-directed industrialization projects may fail, Indeed, we can see from the record of post-war attempts to develop in the third world that there is absolutely no guarantee that they will succeed. No development is possible without them. This was as true in the late 19th century, when Germany, the United States itself, and Japan industrialized, as it was after, when the Soviet Union did, and in the mid and late 20th centuries when European economies and Japan recovered, or in the 60s and 70s when South Korea and Taiwan province industrialized, as it is true today as we see from China's industrialization. I will say parenthetically that it would be very useful to bear in mind that the word globalization is used in China in a very different way than it is used in the rest of the world, especially in the US-led world. In the latter, it means basically free markets and free trade, whereas in China, it means more trade through managed trade. The suppression of this truth, the truth that List identified, has been the overriding ideological mission of the West. If the ruling ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling classes, the ideas that serve their interests and maintain their power, then the ruling ideas about a world order would understandably tend to be those of the dominant powers, that is, there being no world state. These ideas also tend to be useful in perpetuating their dominance, in particular by mystifying the real sources of national wealth and power. To retrieve this truth and propagate it, I have proposed geopolitical economy as a new way of understanding world affairs. And this is a book I wrote in 2013, and a very important quote of Marx, which you will see the significance of as I talk. Not only does geopolitical economy take the division of the world states into nation states and national economies, and between imperialist countries and those resisting them seriously, but it regards both divisions as structurally necessary to capitalism. It returns to Marx's original understanding of capitalism as contradictory value production, which is forgotten by most Western Marxists and most Marxist economists who derive their understandings from Western Marxism. So it returns to Marx's original understanding of capitalism as contradictory value production and his understanding of international relations as the relations of producing nations, hence not geopolitics and geoeconomics, but geopolitical economy. It considers imperialism to be rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. It considers anti-imperialist resistance by those nations that capitalist imperialism would subordinate as inevitable and as therefore expressing the contradiction of capitalist international relations. It considers, like Marx, both nations and classes to be agents of history, contrary to so much Western Marxism, which does not take account of nations at all. Marx says here, if free traders, he said this in 1848 at the height of the version of Marxism, which is generally touted by so-called Western Marxists as being globalist before its time. He says, if free traders cannot understand how one nation can grow rich at the expense of another, we need not wonder these same gentlemen refuse to understand how within one country, one class can enrich itself at the expense of another. This shows that for Marx, nation and class were two agents side by side, working together to make history. A geopolitical economy further considers the resulting dialectic or struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism to be the principal motor that has driven the evolution of the capitalist world order since its beginnings. We can also think of it as a struggle between what Trotsky called uneven development, which privileges imperialism, and combined development, which constitutes a response to it in the form of state-led development. Between the denial of development, which is the essence of imperialism, and the pursuit of development, which is the essence of anti-imperialism. Between the complementarity that imperialist countries would impose between their own high-value production of technologically sophisticated goods and the low-value production of the subordinated world, and the latter's efforts to establish a similarity of productive structures. Further, geopolitical economy argues that in the contest between these two forces, the anti-imperialist side has tended to prevail, slowly but also steadily, making the world ever more multipolar, and that this meant that though some sort of British dominance was inevitable because Britain was the first industrial power, it was also short-lived and unrepeatable, and that the United States had the misfortune of being able to attempt to emulate that sort of dominance only after the world had already become multipolar and hence had already made such attempts unsuccessful. And of course, the US was also fated not just to face challenges from other capitalist countries, but also from socialist ones. Geopolitical economy finally considers the anti-imperialist resistance of national states no less essential to advancing humanity along the path to socialism, or a vision of egalitarian, prosperous, ecologically sustainable, and peaceful cooperative world under any other name. If you don't like socialism, you can call it whatever you like. So it considers this anti-imperialist resistance as being as important as the struggle of classes, women, peoples struggling against exploitation and oppression, an understanding which we and my colleagues and I, my friends and I, also managed to voice in the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. The geopolitical economy of the post-war system of international economic governance was the result, therefore, of the clash between US supranational or cosmopolitanism and the rest of the world's multilateralism, aiming to accommodate their need to breach liberal principles in the interests of recovery, socialism, and development. The principal parameters of the outcome of this clash can be briefly listed. The US desire to construct a liberal world order of the pre-1914 sort could not be fulfilled. The United States' ambition was always thwarted. It had to accept the creation of a United Nations, and though it corrupted its one nation, one vote principle with the permanent members of the Security Council, it had to its goal, had to include within those 5 permanent members the Soviet Union and China. And of course, the creation of such a United Nations also led the United States to create NATO as an alternative institution for the furtherance of its supranational ambitions. Though the US used its war-wrought power to prevent any alternative to the dollar, such as Bancor, issued by a multilateral international clearing union as proposed by Keynes, from being realized and left the world with no alternative to the dollar, it had to agree to continue backing it with gold, and it had to accept capital controls. It had to agree to a multilateralist ITO, the International Trading Organization, and though Congress failed to approve it, the fallback GATT also operated on a multilateral basis and eventually had to not only accommodate European needs of recovery and therefore manage trade, but also further in the 1970s during the Tokyo round, the Third World's demands for a new international economic order. Though the US scored its biggest victories with the IMF and the World Bank, securing vetoes for itself in their design, they would remain relatively obscure until their heyday in the 80s and 90s. And the communist world remained outside these institutions, at least the IMF and the World Bank, which they saw as branches of Wall Street. We cannot examine the evolution of these institutions in any detail here, but 2 points may be noted. The Third World push for multilateralism culminated in the demands for the new international economic order, or many of these demands, to be realized in the Tokyo round of GATT negotiations. And the 1980s, and particularly the 1990s, witnessed a short-lived phase of US supranationalism. However, this period remained brief. By the early 2000s, people were talking about BRICS, and by the 2010s of multipolarity. The WTO, despite its supranational proclamations, remained primarily multilateral rather than supranational, and the planned multilateral agreement on investment was never realized. So, to conclude, what is today called the crisis of multilateralism is in reality a crisis of US supranationalist cosmopolitanism or US imperialism. That crisis has been long in the making and has reached something of a climax today. Though the crisis today takes a violent and conflictual form, thanks largely to the refusal of the United States and some of its allies to understand and accept the new world that is emerging with good grace, it is also allowing true multilateralism to emerge from under all these conflicts that have been caused by this refusal to accept. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.